without further ado, and I don't have big bios on these guys. Number one, because I probably didn't ask for them. Number two, because I think they're both shy. So Colonel Haynes probably not shy, but I know Alan Knisley's shy. But I'm going to drag him up here. My friend Alan Knisley, come on up, Al. Started out life as a school teacher. And when the war happened, he went into the service like everybody else did. And that's where the title of this comes from, because it was 3 years out of his life while he went and did his duty. But when I first met Al, there was an article in Dayton paper talked about World War II guys. So I read it all, reading this thing, and it jumps out off the page. It's like, hey, this guy was a FAC. So I got in the phone book and found him and called him up, invited him to the Jayans dinner. And that night was a wives thing. So I said to my wife, I got a surprise guest going to come to dinner with us. She said, well, who is it? I said, you don't know him. His name's Alan Knisley. He flew as a forward air controller in World War II. She looked at me and said, I know Alan Knisley, hired my first husband. Turns out they taught in the same school system together. So the 6 Degrees of Freedom movie that you see on that's a pretty small world. I give you Alan Knisley, my friend, and one of the initial forward air controllers.
I feel just a little bit insignificant. In fact, I feel a lot insignificant standing up here talking to you, because I did not realize that there would be this many people here and that you would be interested in anything I'd have to say. First off, let me say I did not grow up to be a pilot. I was teaching industrial arts here in Fairborn. It was Osborne then, when the bombers hit Pearl Harbor. And I was single and I was very draftable. And I was drafted, but the superintendent of the schools let me finish the year before I reported, which was a godsend, because I had knew nothing about the Army, had no inclination of what Army life was like or what would happen to me in the Army. My qualifications to speak to you at all today is simply that of a liaison pilot flying artillery planes and directing artillery fire from the air in the European theater. And my service time was just a little over 3 years. And only 2 of those years, a little over 2 of those years, was spent actually doing what I want to talk about in World War II. Another reason I feel insignificant is that many people in the audience I know have had more time in the air than I've had. My Army experience directing artillery fire consisted of just a little over 2 years from, I got to look at the date here, from, it was 60, remember this is 65 years ago, for heaven's sake. I don't remember all this stuff. But my logbook, my Army logbook, shows that I had a little over 1,000 hours of flight time. And I expect there are people in the audience that have had much more flight time than that. The natural tendency, I have to apologize, because a natural tendency, I think, for anyone my age talking about something that long ago, we have 2 tendencies, probably. One is the tendency to recall the more pleasant aspects of what we did and forget about the unpleasant. And the other tendency, which we're all guilty of, I think, is glorifying what we did and making it sound more valuable than it really was. And I realize those are 2 tendencies that I face. I was drafted then out of the Fairborn school system. It was the Osborne school system then. and was to report to the 95th Infantry Division, which was in Camp Swift, Texas. And I'll never forget that ride from Indianapolis to Camp Swift, Texas. We were in a car, a train, and the person in charge was a PFC. And I didn't know what a PFC was, but he pretty soon had us convinced that he was next to God. And this was my initiation. And I was classified in the wisdom of the draft board as a bandsman because I played in the Ohio University Band my freshman year. And that was 3 years later, I'm talking about now. And I wasn't too unhappy about that because I liked playing in the band and I thought that would be great. But I soon learned or heard the rumor that since we were in wartime, that bandsmen were not needed once you got into combat. So they immediately became graves detail people. And I didn't have any stomach for burying the dead, so I asked if I could be transferred out of the band. And they said, sure. And they let me become a telephone linesman. So part of my basic training was running along behind a half track or a 6x6, throwing telephone wire to the side of the road. There wasn't much future in that. But I was sent at the end of my basic training to OCS, Officer Candidate School, to become an artillery officer. Now, I didn't know what an artillery was. I never saw an artillery piece. But it can't be too bad. So I went up to Fort Sill and took my training. And when it looked like I might get through OCS, I suddenly realized that another rumor going around was that people, second lieutenants in the field artillery, were sent up with the infantry as forward observers. And their job was to direct artillery fire on the targets that the infantry defined. Well, this didn't sound too good either. So I started applying for everything that came along to prolong my training and avoid becoming a forward observer. I tried communication school and everything was available. But the thing I got was I was sent to Texas to learn to fly and become an air officer in the artillery. And I spent that time in Texas, which was really a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. And then when I learned to fly and received my wings, liaison pilot wings, I was sent back to Fort Sill to learn to fly all over again the way the artillery wanted me to fly. And it was quite different from ordinary flying. They had me doing all sorts of strange and exciting things like we did barrier takeoffs and barrier landings, crosswind takeoffs and crosswind landings, efficiency takeoffs, contour flying, power off landings, efficiency takeoffs, wingovers, a lot of low altitude flying, and especially stall landings. I got through that and had a lot of fun. And my first assignment was to the 12th Armored Division in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. I didn't last long at Fort Campbell because my excuse was I had never been in an armored division before. I didn't know that the armored divisions wore the overseas cap on the opposite side of the head than the rest of the ground troops. So I was chewed out royally, and I was told that the battalion commander of the artillery that I was assigned to had no use for airplanes. I did not want any airplanes in his group, and that I was to be a forward observer. And there was a light tank waiting for me and a driver, and the outfit was on maneuvers in the Tennessee hills. I found my tank, I found the driver, and we roamed around for a whole day trying to find the outfit we were supposed to be with. Never could find him. Came back in and was not greeted very royally. In fact, I was chewed out pretty much again. And to the point that I said to myself, I can't stand this. I want to be transferred. So I went in again and asked for a transfer to the Air Corps. And he said he was not upset. He didn't like that too well. He says, okay, we'll transfer you, but it won't be to the Air Force. We want you to report immediately at Indiantown Gap to the 3rd Armored Division, who is ready to go overseas, and you're to report without delay. Shook me up quite a bit. My home was in Ohio. I thought, well, gee, I'm not going to report immediately. I'm going to stop and say goodbye to my folks if I'm going to go overseas, which I did do. Then I reported 4 or 5 days late to Camp Campbell, Kentucky. And by this time in my career, I was pretty sure I was not destined to be a soldier. But the first thing they asked me was, why didn't you ask for a delay en route? I said, gee, they told me you were going overseas right away. No, says, no, it'll be a couple of weeks, 3 or 4 weeks before we go. And I said, I'll take my leave now. And he said, okay. So they started out by being kind to me, sent me back to Ohio, and I spent 10 happy days with my folks and reported back to Indiantown Gap to the 3rd Armored Division, specifically to the 67th Field Artillery Battalion. And we were there, more than 3 or 4 weeks. We were there a couple of months before we went overseas. And I began then to feel that I did perhaps have a part in the whole picture. At the end of that period of 2 or 3 months with the 3rd Armored Division at Indiantown Gap, we got our orders to travel overseas. And that was quite an experience too, because at that time, the whole battalion, the whole 67th Battalion was on one ship, but there were several ships in the convoy, and we did a lot of maneuvering on the way over and suspecting any time to be hit by a submarine or something. And we had our orders to exactly what to do if we were hit and that sort of thing. We landed without incident at Liverpool in England and was transported to Warminster, which is a English village on the edge of the Salisbury Plains. And we were told that we would have a few months there prior to the invasion of Europe, but that the invasion of Europe was a necessity. I'll just sort of skip over the 9 months we spent in England prior to the invasion because we didn't do much. I managed to see quite a lot of England. I did a lot of flying officers with a higher rank than I to various places that they wanted to go, and I ran a sort of a annual trip to a farm over in Wales where I could pick up fresh eggs, and that made me kind of popular with the group because the only eggs we had at the post in Warminster were the old Army powdered eggs, which weren't too good, I didn't think. So I'd go up and bring back some fresh eggs for the other people. One thing I would like to mention, and because the person I want to talk about a little bit is right here with me. My dad was on the school board down in Ross County, and when I stopped to see my folks before reporting to Indiantown Gap, he told me of a teacher that he had hired or they had hired, and he said, "She's someone you should meet." And of course, this time I was feeling pretty reckless. I was going overseas, so what the heck? I walked into the old school building where I'd gone to school, knocked on the door, and this young lady came to the door to welcome me, and I was smitten. And she has been my companion ever since. I had 2 dates with her, incidentally, before I went overseas. So our romance was all through correspondence, you might say. But the first thing I did when I got home was to marry her. And she's the greatest thing that ever happened to me in my life. And I can't expect anything greater to ever happen. Her name is Phyllis, and she's still pretty active. Would you stand, Phyllis, please? She's 2 years younger than I. I'm only 88. This is the Grasshopper logo that all of us going through Fort Sill and taking flight training, carried on our jackets and on the nose of our Piper Cubs. Sergeant Pearson was my crew chief at Indiantown Gap and during our time in England, and he was a tremendously fine mechanic. And I don't know what I'd done without him. But when we got into combat or got close to combat, I discovered he was quite a coward. And I recall one time in England, before the invasion, we were on maneuvers out on the Salisbury Plains, and I was awakened with a Tommy gun fire and jumped out of my sack and ran outside, and it was Pearson. He saw a fence post, and he challenged the fence post. When the post didn't answer, he blasted away. And that was my first experience with somebody that was a little scared. And one time, other time, I must mention that we were in after we landed in Normandy, and Normandy, if any of you know anything about it, is a country with very small fields, all surrounded by hedgerows, and not a very good place for an armored division, really. And one time there, after we had pulled into a new position, a Frenchman came running up and said, "Oh, beaucoup boche," which was our term for the Germans, and he pointed down the road. Well, we knew we couldn't stay there if that were true, and we had no alternative but to go down the road and check out what he was telling us. And so I had a small group of my men. There were only about 8 of us. We said, he wanted us to go with him. We followed him down. But Pearson says, Lieutenant, he says, I'm not going down there. He said, you can court-martial me or whatever you want, but I'm not going down that road. It was a path between 2 hedgerows. So I said, okay, you stay here and take care of the equipment, and the rest of us will go. Well, we went down the road. We had our Tommy guns with us, and we were all ready to fire away if we needed to. We couldn't find anybody. We checked the house, we checked the barn, we checked the woods, went back to our original spot, and here was Pearson with his Tommy gun directed on 3 SS troopers who were on the bank, and he was so white just as white as he could be, scared to death, shaking, and the 3 soldiers that he had were shaking too because they could see the condition he was in, and he could fire away at any time. But we had to pry the gun out of Pearson's hands, and we called to our battalion quarters, and they came and picked up our 3 prisoners. So he turned out as a hero. Our time in England, by the way, was this is a girl I took my memories with, a little girl that I just had to have stand up. This is a Stinson L5, which we also used in the artillery, but mainly for administrative reasons. It's a little larger airplane than the Piper Cubs that we wanted to use, but it was great for administrative flying and things like that. So that was our L5. This is a typical group. This is an air section, a self-contained air section, and we operated quite independently from the battalion because we had to be near a field where we could land and take off. And I cherish this picture. Most of the people, I think I'm the only one in that picture that's still alive, by the way. Well, I was never a hero. Before the invasion started, we were visited by a couple of generals to brief us on what was ahead. And they told us, I can still remember the guy saying, he was a general, he was saying, we may lose 100 people, we may lose 200 people, we may lose 1,000 people, we may lose 10,000, but by God, we're going in. And that was the send-off we had before we got into Normandy in the actual fighting of the war. Normandy, as I think I mentioned, was not territory conducive to the actions of an armored unit. It was a country with small fields, high hedgerows around each field, and the 3rd Armored Division was placed in those fields initially when we landed at Normandy. And every time one of our tanks tried to move through the hedgerow, they'd be hit with anti-tank artillery, and they'd go up in smoke. And we were making no progress with our outfit, the 3rd Armored Division. And there was quite, if you know anything about World War II, you know there was quite a stalemate at that time between progress and no progress. We just weren't getting anywhere. But one of my best friends, a lieutenant from Indianapolis, who was with the artillery, he was a gunnery artilleryman. We were together as roommates in Indiantown Gap and roommates 9 months in England, so I knew him very well. His name was Bob Brooke. And after we landed in Normandy, the second day he was killed. He was the first in our division to be killed, riding in a Jeep with 3 others, running over a landmine. There wasn't a mark on his body, and no one else in the Jeep was hurt, but he was killed. And it made quite an impact on me because when we pulled out of New York Harbor to go overseas, we were standing looking at the Statue of Liberty and making small talk and saying, wonder when we'd see the Statue of Liberty again. And Bob says, I don't know when you'll see it again, but I'll never see it. And that's the first indication I had that he had any kind of a premonition about his future. And from that point on, anytime we talked about what we were going to do after the war and, our various bull sessions, Bob would always say, count me out, I'm not going to be there. And he lived in Indianapolis, right close to the racetrack over there, and we all said, planned, that when the war was over, by golly, we're going to go and visit you in Indianapolis and take in the races. He says, come ahead, but I won't be there. Peg will be there. That was his wife, and she'll take care of you. And he was the first one in a division of 18,000 people to be killed in Normandy. And Phyllis and I visited his grave a few years ago when we were over there. But that's one of the, he was a happy-go-lucky guy, just as more fun to be with than anything, but he just knew he wasn't coming back. And that was it. Didn't bother him, didn't worry him at all. He had more fun than anybody. And it was my first experience with people who had a premonition, and he certainly had one. We had, as I said before, we had a stalemate in Normandy for a matter of too long. We weren't very, very successful with our armored divisions. We lost a lot of tanks, and a tank, one of our tanks at least, hit by enemy 88 millimeter shells would explode and burn up. And the people inside the tank had no chance at all. And we lost a lot of tanks and a lot of people fighting in this Normandy setting between the hedgerows. And eventually the higher-ups decided something had to be done. So they planned a saturation bombing of the area. This is what the graveyards looked like in Normandy. This is the lower one is the grave of my friend Bobby Brooke, and the two above it are the graves of Francis Farrell, who was our battalion, or not our battalion, but the division air officer. And Francis was killed along with another pilot, Sergeant or Lieutenant Pfeiffer, over Stolberg, killed by our own artillery. One of the great hazards we had to face was flying into the path of our trajectory, because artillery shoots a looping shot. And if you happen to get in the way of one of those shells and they hit the airplane in the air, it was all over. And that's what happened to Frank. The other stone that I took the picture of General Maurice Rose, who was our division commander, and he is the only division commander killed in World War II. But he was a guy who loved the tanks, who liked to be up front, and was always up front, and that's what killed him. There's a tremendously fine hospital in Denver, Colorado, named after him. But if you had to pick a general to work under or with, you couldn't go wrong with Maurice Rose. He was a great man in my book. We didn't see very much of the Luftwaffe, incidentally, during the Battle of Normandy and the Battle of France. But they came over at night, every night. We call them night check Charlies, and dropped a lot of anti-personnel bombs on us. But back to the breakthrough at St. Lo, which is in Normandy, and this saturating bombing that I mentioned. According to what I have written here in my record, there were 1,800 heavy bombers, 1,400 medium bombers, and 700 fighter bombers, all operating in a very small area. So it was genuine saturation bombing. And I watched it from the air, and my commanding officer, Colonel Berry, came down, and we went up and flew at about 300 feet and observed the bombing. The first bombers came over and dropped smoke bombs to mark the front line. But unfortunately, the wind wasn't cooperating and the smoke drifted back over our own troops. So many of these bombs from this large contingent of bombers were dropped on our own troops. And that's something that people back home never knew, but it was a rather sickening sight. We had many people killed along with many animals during this saturation bombing. And we discovered that there was no way that we, on the ground of the ground forces, could communicate with the Air Corps in a situation like that. We were just powerless. We couldn't stop it. We could talk to our own people on the ground, but not to the people in charge of the Air Corps. You can't imagine the stench that arose from all of the killing that occurred during this bombing of St. Lo. But they learned something. They found out after the bombing of St. Lo that they were not using armored divisions the way they were supposed to be used. So then they decided to take us out of the little pasture fields, put us on the highway, and let us spearhead forward, bypassing enemy infantry and whatever. And this turned out to be a wise move in the use of the armored divisions. And then, because we were the 3rd Armored Division, we became known as the Spearhead Division, because that's what our task was after the bombing at St. Lo. We spearheaded ahead of troops, bypassing a lot of the enemy, and it was very effective. We could go as far as we wanted to, I guess, with our tanks, and let the infantry come along behind us and clean up. But it was not very good for an air section, because I had to move my group along with the artillery battalion that we were supporting. And I had to keep up with them, at least within FM radio contact with them. So it meant a lot of movement, and we often had to move our little landing fields into an area, of course, where we could first land the airplanes, and secondly, that had not been cleaned up. And so it made life kind of interesting. It did have some interesting facets. We had some personal encounters with the Germans during this time, because I remember one time I was wanting to move my air section. I landed in a field that looked good, taxied up to a woods, and as I got out of the airplane and lit a cigarette, felt somebody behind me and turned around. Here was a German soldier holding his gun up, wanted me to take it. He wanted to surrender. I couldn't take him in the Cub. And I had to point to the column, our 3rd Armored Column, which was down a few miles, pointed him in that direction, and he took off in that direction. I don't know whatever happened to him, but I hope he found somebody that he could give up to. But we would often find not only live soldiers in areas where we were bivouacking, but we'd also find a lot of dead ones. During our sojourn through France and Belgium, one of my close buddies, the air officer of the 391st, was shot down by Messerschmitts. They came out of the sun and struck his Piper Cub. I don't think he knew what hit him, but he was killed, and the 391st was more convicted to what they were doing in the 67, so they sent me over there temporarily to be the artillery officer of the 391st. And I ended up spending the rest of my career as the air officer of the 391st. And the picture you saw of that group up here was my 391st group. But we traveled very rapidly through Belgium, less than 10 days, but we were treated great. Everybody in Belgium loved the Americans, and we wondered if they loved the Germans just as much when they were through there. But you expect to be invited into their basements or their cellars for a drink or wine, and or into their house for a meal, and great people. We managed to get into Germany near Stolberg, and I think, and I might be wrong, but I think I'm the first person to have landed on German territory and taken off during the war without any mishap. I landed beyond the Dragon's Teeth, and it was customary then, at that time, once we got into Germany, to bivouac and take over someone's house if we wanted to, and evict them. And I want to tell you this because this is my most memorable experience of the World War. We landed one time very close to Stolberg, which is in Germany, and there was a nice pasture field. It was a dairy farm, and when we landed, the people who lived there and ran the dairy farm came out of their house and invited us in to their, well, I don't know if there's a picture, I can get a picture of them or not. But the interesting thing was that these were German people. They had 4 daughters. Their oldest daughter had been married to a German soldier, and he had been killed by the Americans about 3 or 4 months before we were there. And they invited us into their home, and we just became close to them. And we were stuck at that position for over a month, and they treated us like family. There were 4 daughters, and all from 18 and up, but no hanky-panky went on. They were like sisters to our men, and the family was just great. We shared our rations with them, and when we finally moved on, we left our dress uniforms there because the Battle of the Bulge was starting. Told them we'd be back to pick them up when we could. In the meantime, when the Battle of the Bulge started, no one knew exactly which direction the Germans were going to go, but the people that we were staying with feared that they would come there and find our uniforms, and they would be killed too. So they buried them in the barnyard, covered them over with a pile of manure, and when we went back to get them, we found this out. We didn't know it at the time, but after the Battle of the Bulge, we went back to get our uniforms, we found out what they had done. But they were the wonderful people. Never missed going to church, and we've been told in training that the Germans had burned down all the churches, but these people were the most religious group of people I have ever been with, and next to my own family, I think one of the finest groups I'd ever been. Not all Germans were bad. They were like us in war because they had to be, I guess.
I hate to do this, but we're going to take everybody else's time. Alan, that was wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for doing that. That is part of our history, and what a great thing. Thank you.